Okay, well, the first thing to say is thank you very much. And I should also say I don't really do like formal interviews. So if I have to sort of
we could just talk to each other, couldn't we?
Yeah, if I have to stare at my questions for a sort of like nervous silence for a minute, then you'll have to bear with me. So I thought I'd start by just telling you about me, because you probably don't know much about me. So obviously I'm from Extinction Rebellion. I helped set it up last January. I did a paper on why we should be doing mass civil disobedience on climate change. That was based on my research. I'm a researcher at King's College. I do research on how to create effective radical change. And my background is I've been an organic farmer for 25 years. So all this is all very new. I spent like 20 years weeding carrots and things, thinking that was my life. And then that's another of these climate change stories when, you know, it rained all year and I lost my crops, and it was a bit of a wake-up call. And obviously, like everyone else that reads the news and the science, it sort of accumulates upon you over the years, doesn't it? I've also got a Christian background, though I have to say, like, I stopped being sort of formally a Christian when I was 18, so sorry about that. Thought I'd get that confession in first. So my mother was a Methodist local preacher, so we just had the whole sort of Christian thing, church every Sunday. So I'm sort of familiar but slightly rusty, as you might say, on the Christian side of things. But I've got this list of questions here and I messed around with it a bit, but personally I'd like to ask you a little bit about your Christian faith, actually, and how that can give a deeper perspective, I think. First of all, obviously, it was fantastic because we, started this Extinction Rebellion thing. And as you can imagine, we were a little bit nervous because when you say you're going to have a rebellion against the British government, either people think that's extremely silly or extremely antisocial. So, but what was amazing from the start is a lot of people were going, yes, that sounds reasonable. And I sort of, the biggest surprise for me, I suppose, was we started doing these public talks, and you have 70 people turn up in Carmarthen or something, and you're going, well, this is different. But what was surprising was a number of figures did come out of the establishment, for want of a better word, saying, yes, this is objectively a massively serious situation. And one of those was you. So I remember that someone telling me, ex-Archbishop of Canterbury is going to sign a letter. I was going, oh my God. So I was wondering if you could start off just by saying how you came to that decision. Was it a sort of out of the blue, or had you been thinking about it for a while? Is climate change something you think about a lot, or increasingly? How can you set the scene on that for us?
The whole environmental question has been quite a big thing for me since I suppose I was in my 20s, and very much connected with the kind of work I was doing as a teacher of theology and a student of theology. Because the sort of Christianity that I largely grown up with and that I was studying, especially the Christianity of the Eastern churches, that lays a lot of emphasis on the idea that the world we're in is sacramental, it's charged with life. It's not just stuff lying around there. And that our response to the world around, the need, the balance of the world around, is actually part of our spiritual life. There's not a great cleft between spiritual and material. And to understand the world in its proper sense is to understand something of God. So that's the kind of deep background I come out of. And by the end of the 70s, I was very conscious that this was coming up over the horizon as a practical political issue. And I guess that when I was Archbishop, one of the handful of themes I kept on coming back to, in speaking publicly, in preaching, in teaching, and to some extent direct advocacy, was around the climate change issue as it was evolving. When the environmental thing started, it was much more about, general issues on pollution and the corruption and degradation of the environment. And then gradually, of course, it became much clearer that this was a very, very focused, very specific kind of trackable thing to do with our entire climate, the entire ecology. So that's where it came from, and that's why I did a couple of public events, public lectures on this. I've been pushing the eco-church idea. We even had a sort of environmental audit of Lambeth Palace, the Archbishop's headquarters in London, to see how we were doing. The answer being, could be worse, but could be a lot better. I took a year without flying, just to, make some sort of public statement that this is possible, you could live without that. And then, just the last piece of the jigsaw, so to speak. As Archbishop, I used to travel quite a lot, and travelled frequently, of course, to places which were, if you like, on the front line of climate change. So watching what was going on in Kenya, for example, with soil degradation and deforestation, desertification, and some of the small-scale cooperative responses to that was a very important moment for me. Talking to bishops and others from the Pacific, where rising sea levels are the most dramatic instance of all this, or Bangladesh, these are, as I say, the front lines, and this is why climate change is an issue of political justice, not just of environmental stability, for the simple reason that it's the most vulnerable people who are on the receiving end of the worst consequences. A few years ago, I became chair of Christian Aid, the development charity, and one of our major strategic campaigning concerns is climate change, because the interlocking of climate change and development questions is very tight. We know that people's livelihoods are at stake in the most vulnerable bits of the world because of climate change. So all of that came together to give me an ongoing sense of urgency about it. And to be honest, I'm ready to support almost any public advocacy position and action that will underline the urgency of where we are with this.
What I always find a little bit interesting when people talk about climate change is, because we've been talking about it for 30 years, it tends to lose its edge a little bit. It's like, and then there's climate change.
Yeah, then there's climate change.
And the nature of it, as I see it, the objective exponential increase in its direness, as you might say, is not really grasped, because the same word has been used for quite a long time. And do you share that sense of what I would say is the absolute urgency of it? I mean, my understanding, and being a social scientist, I do have a sort of slightly naive, empirical view of the world where if something's happening, it's happening. So my understanding, the situation, we're at 1.2 or thereabouts above the pre-industrial period. And one of the things I find quite peculiar is people don't talk about these locked-in increases, which have come to light, that there's a carbon lag, that even if we didn't, even if we stopped putting carbon into the atmosphere, we've still got 0.5, arguably more to come through. And then another thing people don't talk about is this global dimming, which is once we've got rid of the pollution and the coal, then we're looking at 0.7 or thereabouts, which is going to increase again. So my maths takes that over 2. And then we've got the latent heat effect. There's a certain amount of boring but, indisputable physics here, which takes us into the realm of, to put it bluntly, like the mass death of human beings through loss of habitat. One scientist said at 5 degrees over pre-industrial, there'd be only 1 billion people left. So even if he's quite a lot wrong, that's still beyond catastrophic. Yeah. And could you say, is that something that you've become aware of as well? Or is,
Yes, and that's part of, I think, what comes from, for me, from encountering the question very much in the context of already impoverished and vulnerable communities. When you think that there are islands disappearing in the Pacific, becoming uninhabitable, and I've talked to people from those islands who will describe exactly what it's like, will show me photographs of rising sea levels and uninhabitable villages which are abandoned, or people from Bangladesh who will show me the charts of salination of what used to be fresh water. And you think that's what happens, quite simply. That's what happens. Multiply that by God knows how much, given the figures you've just mentioned, and we're into this question of real survival questions, real survival issues. And I'm astonished at the lack of urgency about this. It's, I suppose, for so many people, almost too big to take in. And when we're faced with problems that are too big to take in, the temptation is always to close down, to shut down the systems, and put your fingers in your ears or a paper bag over your head, and just hope it'll go away. And the two things I think we can do, and this is crucial. One is, and I keep coming back to this often with church groups and so on, there are small steps you can take that are just better. Never mind whether they're going to change everything. They're better. Start now to discover a better balance of life. You can do it, and it's worth doing just because it's more human, it's more in tune with where we are. But the second thing is, well, do we or don't we believe in democracy? Do we or do we not believe that we can change the minds and hearts of political leaders? It takes quite an act of faith. Speaking as a religious person, I think it takes a bigger act of faith sometimes than it does to believe in God. But what are the tools, what are the levers we can use? Our democracy is, in many ways, very stale and very static. And we see that in this country at the moment in the most depressing way possible. So, democracy has to be renewed from the ground up. It has to be renewed by people finding ways of presenting viable alternatives. It's not a kind of 19th century romanticism about revolution, just pick up the cobblestones and man the barricades. It's saying, how do we make it sufficiently clear to our public and our politicians that this is something urgent that human beings want to see changed?
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to support this particular venture.
Yep, so I'd like to sort of ask two questions about the Christian faith a little bit as well, because obviously, having come from a Christian background myself, I see that it's part of you, if you know what I mean. It doesn't leave you. And one of the things that intrigues me, and we've got a question here, is it seems like central to the Christian faith is love thy neighbour. And I was wondering if you could comment about how that plays out. What is the moral imperative for Christians and indeed all people of goodwill, as you might say, in terms of this catastrophe we're facing?
Two crystal clear things. One is human beings are at risk because of climate change. If I love my human neighbour, then I have an absolute duty to do what I can to minimise that risk, to protect them from disaster. Second thing, which has become clearer and clearer to me in recent years, I have to say, is the neighbourhood is my neighbour. The world itself, the material stuff of the world, is my neighbour. I need to be reacting responsibly, lovingly to the world I'm in, the physical world I'm in. And that's just as much part, I think, of loving the neighbour as loving the human neighbour.
Yeah, and again, I feel a bit nervous trying to bring in a bit of theology with you, because I'm sure I'm not going to quite get it right. But I see the actions I've taken as an act of sacrifice. I've been arrested about 10 times in the last 2 years. I've been to prison. I've been on 2 hunger strikes, and one of the things that a lot of people sort of say to me is something along the lines of, "Oh my goodness, that's amazing. And, you know, how did you manage to do that? And I feel a bit embarrassed because for me, it's like, it's a fulfillment of who I am. And I think in the Christian tradition, which is the tradition I say I come from, you become whole through sacrifice. It's not a cost, as in a sort of neoliberal sort of calculation, that I do nice things and then I go to prison. It's more, no, when you go to prison, then that is a fulfillment of your faith or your humanity in the face of evil, as you might say. And I've struggled really to communicate this to people, but I do genuinely feel it. And empirically, as it were, I've done research that people that do make sacrifices from their faith or from their sense of humanity are actually happier human beings, which is, of course, is quite counterintuitive. And I was wondering if you could comment on, you know, there's lots of sacrifices coming down the way, one way or another. We all know that now. So, you know, could you comment on how you see Christian sacrifice in this context?
Yes, I mean, you put it very well, that it's not a sort of calculated cost you pay down for a future benefit. It's much more a matter of witnessing to a possibility that fills you with hope. The world doesn't have to be like this. And to put it very, very bluntly, the person who's pushing back against the way the world is doing so not just out of a negative feeling, but out of a positive feeling. My humanity needs something more, needs more space, needs more justice, needs more equity and joy. And that's why it fills me with energy to do this. I mean, it's a tiny thing by comparison, but my one experience of this was being arrested on an anti-nuclear protest about 30 years ago.
Yeah, I was as well, yeah. Probably saw you.
probably in the same police station. You know, the sense that comes with that is, you know, what we're saying is, look, friends, it does not have to be like this. There is another way of seeing the world, and it's liberating. And just see past the apparent dominance of all these negative habits, and you see something about your own humanity growing into fullness. So yeah, it's not a gloomy picture at all, but sacrifice, you know, it's a word that has a kind of rather negative, gloomy feel about it, and I think they're one of the great phrases in the New Testament about Christ enduring his suffering because of the joy that was set before him. And the sense that there could be a joyful, a life-giving relation with our environment. That's, isn't it? That's why we push here.
Yeah, that reminds me of, you know, the sense of excitement and even joy that existed on the bridges in November. Yes. Were you there? I don't know if you...
I was leafleting here in Cambridge
that
day. In a very small way, but the same sense of excitement among the little
like
group.
You sort of decided to make a stand.
Yes.
And I think there's a sense that if you're living a lie, if you're conflicted inside in terms of your moral conscience, there is a liberation that comes from, I'm actually going to stand up.
Your energy is drained away by living with contradictions.
Yeah. I mean, without beating around the bush, you are an establishment figure in many people's eyes. You know, you've been the Archbishop of Canterbury, and people are looking to you to sort of make a moral response in terms of what the church should or shouldn't be doing. And I'm wondering, you know, have you talked to the present Archbishop about global dimming and the carbon lag and what have you? And is there going to be some movement, do you think, on that in terms of divestment, for instance, and what have you?
I don't know. I'm out of the institutional loop now, so I don't have any direct leverage there. I know there's a lot of pressure. I know that the Church Commissioners, the trustee body of the Church of England, have already taken some steps in this direction, have set some targets about divestment. It's a start. It's slow, but it is a real start. Just as with the university here, same issue.
Yeah.
You move centimetre by centimetre to get it across, and it's so frustrating because of that sense of urgency. And sometimes you have to bite your tongue and say, yeah, it's better than nothing. Let's use what's there and keep pushing. So I don't know with the church, and I am aware of the way in which in the last, say, 20 years, most of the Christian churches have got more literate on this subject. I mean, now you've got Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, which really is one of the best things there is from the Christian point of view. It's really clear and hard-hitting. And the Greek patriarch has made even stronger statements in the last 10, 15 years. So there's quite a lot in the bank there.
Yes, but is this, the question that comes to me is, like, words are fine, but at some point there's a moral imperative to take transgressive political action. I mean, we all know this because, no one disputes in the Second World War that people, should have taken drastic action to protect the Jews, for instance. So it's not like it's an impossibility morally for people. But what I'm interested in is, when are the representatives of Christian faiths actually going to go into rebellion against these states which, as we saw with the children's strike on Friday, they're going to obliterate the lives of billions of children. I mean, I can't see any way around making that statement. Do you see what I mean? Even though I can't quite believe it. It's like there in the physics, in the moral responsibility. So do you think there is going to become a point where they're going to go, I can't abide this? Is that on the way, do you think?
I think we're closer to it than we were 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, maybe. And yeah, there are words, certainly lots of words, and maybe too many words and not enough action. But the words are at least getting into the system, pushing in the right direction, I'd say. So,
yeah, because I think there's, to be blunt, there's a lot of anger, boiling up in this society. I mean, we know that from the inequality. And I see it because, I've been a researcher on the streets of London, working with casualised workers and what have you. There's a burning sense of injustice. And that's been going on for a long time. And then on top of that, people are now realising that not only have people been robbed of their labour, as you might say, they're also heading towards their deaths in order to protect the privileges of the rich and powerful for another few years. And do you think that there is going to be a time of reckoning here?
I think there is, but as you speak, I also say, are there yet enough people who know that with enough clarity to give them a sense of not only urgency but power about it, that they can do something? Because so many people either tune out or, look at the United States, simply deny en masse, simply deny. The very people who are going to be most at risk will not look at this and are encouraged and almost exhorted not to look at it by the present government of the United States and so on. Now there's an incredible amount of work to be done there just on getting people to look.
Yeah, we've had this amazing turnout of kids and students and what have you on Friday, and would you care to comment about that?
I found it really heartening and really encouraging that the young generation understand these issues, care about them, want to be visible, want to stand up and be counted. Just as in the United States, I think, with gun crime in the last year or so, suddenly another generation has risen up and said, we're not having this. We are actually taking our power and our freedom. And when people are dismissive about the narrowness or the selfishness or whatever of the young generation, I have to say it's not my experience, and this confirms it in spades.
Don't take the vote! Don't take the vote!
You are now entering a rebellion.
face.
Like a lot of people for the last 10 or 20 years, been really aware that if climate change isn't sorted out, catastrophic things are going to happen.
In April 2018, we made the decision to start a rebellion.
The strategy is block the roads.
Sorry, you're going to get stuck on the bridge if you go there.
And then all the bigwigs come down.
We have an idea that setting up an organisation for young people within XR.
What we're going to be doing is going to be arrestable.
It's not a rally, you know, it is a rebellion. We are here to get our demands met and we're going to stay until we do.
If you're on the railway line, there is a line along the centre of it, and if you touch that, you'll be killed.
You're arresting the wrong people! Careful, you're hurting him.
How do we find out how to be more tactically effective against the police? And secondly, how do we get them to rebel?
We are very possibly the last generation.
There is a call out for people to head down this side street and let's save the boat.
We're being watched right now. They're preparing to close in on this spot.
Good, double that. I did the police, she did the crowd. Right, okay. We'll prepare the troops.
This is just, you know, a chapter in an age-old, thousands of years rebellion against a destructive and domination system.